Son of an architect, Bernard Tschumi grew up in a house that doubled as a design office. Raised in Switzerland and in France, it took a student exchange trip to the United States for architecture to capture his heart. He went on to design such major projects as the $300 million Parc de la Villette in Paris and the $25 million La Fresnoy National Studio for Contemporary Arts. It is also in France. He recently marked his American debut with the completion of Columbia University's new student center, the Alfred Lerner Hall. It was named one of the top 10 designs of 1999 by Time Magazine's International Edition. He is also Dean of the School of Architecture at Columbia University. Welcome to the program. Welcome back to the program. And congratulations on Alfred Lerner Hall. What's interesting to me, before we see this, is just to talk about you and this division of labor in your life. Tell me how they connect. Why are you doing both? And what's the passion that sort of drives you forward? I mean, do you need both ends of this, the intellectual discipline of the university, the opportunity to use a base at a school of architecture and to connect with literature and science and other disciplines? And do you at the same time find being part of an intellectual life not necessarily totally satisfying, so you need to be out there on the front lines of designing things? And finally, does it all come together when you design a building on the very campus where you work?
I think you know already too much about architecture. As you know, architecture, when you build, is such a hands-on activity where every minute of the day you're involved with way to put things together, to make sure that the contractors, the technology, the client, the money, all these things, with very mundane things, are worked out. At the same time, you have a very strong beliefs in the fact that architecture also ought to connect with higher values of society, with issues which you can find in, let's say, philosophy or in the best realm of culture. The university historically has provided that context, and it's always very interesting to be part of the debate of ideas at the same time as you're getting your hands dirty in the mud. And so as over the years, I've always tried to play a little bit, you know, this sort of a way to have a foot in both worlds, but it's the same body in a sense. And Columbia has been quite wonderful insofar as, because of being located in New York City, which is really the center hub of activities and of debate, it was possible to turn the school, let's say the architecture activity at Columbia, as a sort of platform for debate, for new ideas. And simultaneously, it would not have been enough for me. And don't forget, in a sense, if I started as a theoretician, if I started as someone who was better known for ideas and concepts, then from the Parc de la Villette onwards, I was really a hands-on person. So in a sense, that need of playing one against the other is probably a form of a definition of what architecture is. It's both conceptual and experiential.
Yeah. And do you define yourself as a European or an American in your heart, in your head?
You know, before Europe versus America, it's Paris versus New York. I'm a person of the city. It's very, very important. I chose to live in a city called Paris. I chose to live in a city called New York because they are the most extraordinary cities in the world. And for some reason, again, because of wanting to have the best of both worlds, I have elected to live in both cities. Well, I spent a lot more time in New York, probably, 3 weeks for 1 week in Paris. And I still want to go back and forth. And because I see a sort of complementarity in what they propose. And sure, you know, I'll never be American, but I'm not quite European anymore, you know. And so, but the starting point is really the city. I think that even in the work that I do as an architect, is an intensely urban metropolitan work. It's not a work that has fascination for nature attributes, for the peaceful landscape. It's something that really thrives on conflict, thrives on the intensity of the life, in the metropolis.
Staying with the metropolis and the city, if Paris and New York, and a lot of people would agree with you, are the two most exciting, most powerful, most interesting cities, the most enjoyable cities, the most stimulating cities, will that continue into this century? Or does another city have, for whatever reason, in Asia, somewhere else, have an opportunity, is in the process of becoming a great city?
Well, we know that, historically cities come and go.
Berlin is on the rise.
Berlin is again on the rise. It's, we'll see. And it's so the life of cities certainly goes through cycles. And even in our lifetime, we have seen our own cities in New York going through a number of cycles. The same applies to Paris. Whether another city is going to take over, I do not know. Because you talk about different cultures, Asian cities are moving differently, but will it replace what, again, Paris has, I consider,
I'm not suggesting about replacing, I'm suggesting joining these places as great cities.
Yes, I'm sure that...
I mean, people would argue with London and all this other, but just staying those cities that we may not...
Absolutely. No, I think this will take place. I do not know which one. Yeah. I tend, probably for my own history, to work on a pendulum between those two places across the Atlantic. But there's absolutely no reason to consider that other, especially in Asia, that other metropolises are going to join, the group.
You know what's interesting as we talk about this is to see what's happened in the last 25 years. We have seen architecture put a city on the map, Bilbao, on a map. Most Americans had never thought about Bilbao, and now they go there because of one piece of architecture, right?
That's correct.
It shows you the transforming impact of what architecture, I think, can be.
That's right. But look, architecture has always been about identity. When you as an architect is confronted with a job, you know that on one hand you have to solve certain programmatic issues, certain technological issues, but you know that you also have to provide an identity for the institution that is going to be housed in that building. So the notion of identity can be applied to a city just as well. Bilbao had an identity.
Sure, I'm not denigrating Bilbao before Guggenheim.
But then it has a new identity helped forth by a building. Yeah. And that's part of the role of architecture. To give identity. In a sense, we were talking, about Lerner Hall. Lerner Hall at Columbia, one of the purposes was to find an architecture which would be identifiable with the idea of a student center.
Okay, but let me hold off on Lerner Hall because there are a lot of interesting things about Lerner Hall, including the fact that you got to face Broadway, which is one whole life out there, very different than the other side, which is an academic campus.
That's right.
So you got one side facing a campus, one side facing an urban street.
Yep.
And what do you do in between is equally interesting. So we'll come to that in a minute. Yeah. Is American culture dominating the world? American film, American ideas, American technology?
Yes and no. Yes, because that's generally becoming a norm. But as we know, culture is not made of the norm. Culture is also made of the exceptions. And so very often you find these exceptions being born from, in those local places elsewhere. And what has always been very powerful in the exchange between France and America has been that import and export. Recently, in another context, I was fascinating to note that in the 50s, the technological culture, the car culture, invaded France.
Right.
And it was very clearly coming from America.
The car
culture, of course.
A subject you know and love.
A subject we all know and love. So invaded France. French intellectuals used to love fast cars, convertibles, driving them against trees and things
That's
of this sort. But 15, 20 years later, you had another wave going from France, the history of ideas, what was understood here in America as post-structuralism, going from one, or even take film, you know, the nouveau cinéma, the new cinema, and so on, moving and having an influence on what is happening in the cultural life here in America. So that import and export between, and it's not necessarily high culture and low culture, it's simply different realm of culture.
But my argument would be, or my question would be, or both, that's a long time ago when French cinema influenced American cinema.
That's right.
Godard?
Yep.
That's been some while ago.
That's the French cinema, but you can say that Wim Wenders from another corner had a said. But you know something? You should not necessarily look at it as purely the cinema towards the cinema. Take European cinema has major effect on young artists during a certain period here in the United States.
Artists as in painters or artists as in all creators?
Yeah, all creators, but I'm thinking more of the visual arts, you know. If I think of David Sally, or if I think of Robert Longo, or even Cindy Sherman, there were a number of artists of a certain generation who were very aware of, let's say, movie makers like Fassbinder or Wenders or so.
Right.
So in this respect, it doesn't go as a sort of relationship of one field toward another. Take again the realm of ideas, literary criticism, and its effect on architecture. You know, these type of crossovers, I think, are not only happening between disciplines, but happening between continents and between, of course, cities.
Let me talk about architecture in terms of specifics here, and we'll come back to some of these broader themes. But first, you. It is a true story. You had both Swiss and French citizenship, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Because?
Yes, my mother is French, or was French, and my father was Swiss, and that's as simple as that.
What did your father do?
My father was an architect. My father was an architect who was actually came to France at age 17, went to school at the École des Beaux-Arts there, and had a fairly important activity in France. And during the war, started the School of Architecture in Lausanne, in Switzerland. My mother and I kept living in France till I was about 10, and then we moved to Switzerland. So at that time, I was, you know, more there until came to America.
And this story is about you going to see Louis Kahn's work or somebody's work in wherever it was. It gave you the inspiration or the motivation or something.
This is very interesting. Seeing how, again, back to cities. It all happened in Chicago. I was an exchange student. I was 16 or 17. I had come from a context, a milieu, which was highly literary. In other words, my mother had a great literary passion that she had communicated to me. And I was going much more in that direction in terms of what I intended to do later. And being in a totally transplanted environment, I spent about 6 months in the Midwest, and then during that winter went to Chicago and went to the normal, tour, right? Frank Lloyd Wright, Richardson, Sullivan, and so on. And I was mesmerized, but even more than by the individual building, by the power of the city itself. And in the middle of a late evening, middle of a snowstorm, being on the top of the highest building in Chicago at the time, which was the Prudential Tower, looking down at the city, I felt that there was no question that, that power was the one I wanted to be part of, and that at that moment that I decided to become an architect. And it was unusual because I immediately sort of, called my parents, my father, said that, and there was a surprise because they had not encouraged me. It's a hard job to be an architect.
Were they pleased?
I don't know. I think my father was secretly pleased. Yeah. But he died a few days later, actually.
He did?
Yes.
But he died knowing that his son...
Knowing that his son would be an architect. Well,
That means something, I think. I mean, I think lots of fathers want their sons to do what they do, whether the sons choose it or not.
Only if they're
If they're
obsessively passionate about it.
If they love it, they want to somehow.
I think, as you know, the work of an architect requires that you work 16 hours a day and you think about very little else, and you have to know what you want.
Yeah, but you know what? I think that's true. I think that's true about the best in any profession. I mean, whether it's football coaches or journalists, the best, because how hard you work and what you put into it is reflected in what comes out of it, and those that combine some talent. And without that element of 16 hours, you will never be the best. I don't think, I mean, I see it in every profession. I've never had anybody come to this table who's done extraordinarily well in whatever profession, male, female, young, old, who's ever said to me, I have achieved this thing that you admire because I was smarter than everybody else. They all say, I achieved this thing that you admire because I worked harder. I cared more. My passion burned brighter, and my will was stronger.
True.
You know? True. Take a look at Alfred Lerner Hall. It came about because what? What was the challenge? How did it begin?
Well, it started probably 10 or 15 years ago. People at Columbia, students, faculty, administration had felt that the old student center, which was small and derelict, needed an upgrade. Right. It needed to be enlarged. But how do you do this? Columbia is a very sensitive campus, not only politically, as we knew once upon a time, but, of course, architecturally. It's a fantastic urban environment. It's one of the best set pieces. The McKim and White master plan is quite extraordinary. The only other equivalent in New York City is Rockefeller Center.
Sure. Now, just explain who they were and when they did this master plan for the university, because you still had to live within the boundaries of that master plan.
In the 1880s, even a little earlier than that, Columbia decided to move to Morningside Heights and decided to create a campus, but literally a very precisely defined campus. Hired at the time the best known, the very important architects of the time, McKim, Mead, and White, who were trained as many of the architects of the period in their trip going to Rome and being filled with neoclassical culture and architectural culture. They design that master plan, which has been guided the evolution of Columbia for almost 100 years, or over 100 years now. At certain period of its history, that was a little forgotten, and a strange thing happened. And so when we were asked to look at that problem, because first of all, were we going to demolish the old building or not? That's a small issue. I think very quickly one needed enough space to do a building twice as large. It needed a new building. But then, were we going to ignore the master plan or consider that perhaps in that last corner we were going to finish the master plan? Now, for myself, who is known as not a contextual architect, someone who would rather break the rule than play with the rule, that was a very difficult thing, because I knew most of my friends would totally object to me trying to say, no, let's finish the master plan. So I said, look, it's, again, like driving. If I'm in England, I will drive on the left side of the road. Otherwise, I get killed or I get arrested. Or in that particular case, as an architect, I get fired. Columbia also had a very clear mandate. Wanted to
finish the master plan.
But I think that was a proper thing. So in other words, I take also responsibility for saying, yes, that's what we're going to do. That was the norm. But then within the norm, there was something fascinating, that there was the possibility which was shown of breaking away from the norm. The master plan of McKim and White talked about a row of building along the avenue, along Broadway, and a second row of building right along it, along campus. That had been done only once for Avery Hall, which is the architecture building. So I said, let's do this, to have those two wings the Broadway wing and the campus wing, and the void in between.
That's where I can be creative.
That's right. And not only that, it happens that the topography of the Columbia is such that Broadway is half a story lower than the campus. So I can link those two wings by a set of ramps that connect them. And from that have a complete continuity of activities in the building, quite an extraordinary spatial effect, and also solve a number of things that I wanted to solve, which was have a very transparent facade, so the ramps support the facade in an almost magic way. There are no mullions, there are no columns, it's just,
the ramps are the support.
The ramps are the support.
This is so interesting to me, I want to show it too. So let's just take a look at these slides, and you describe to me what I am in fact going to see. That is what?
That's the view from campus, but the dark part is the place of the ramps. In other words, you have the light campus wing in the center of the picture. Then the dark place, which we'll see more in detail, I think, a little later, with the system of ramps that links it to the Broadway wing.
Next slide.
Here it is.
There are the ramps.
Close up, we start to see the ramps. It's a fairly elaborate hanging system. Structurally, it's quite sophisticated. The ramps act as a truss. They literally span 100 feet and support the glass itself. And at night, you see people walking as shadows, as a shadow theater in front of the ramps. Here it is, you're inside, and it's completely open towards campus. In other words, as opposed to many of the student centers in the country, which tend to be quite introverted, we said, let's open it toward campus so that you have quite an awareness of where you are at all times. And then, as part of that continuum of movement through the building, you walk along the glass. You see, by the way, the glass, the ramp are also covered in glass in order to have a translucent capability that you bring a lot of light inside this major space. I do strongly believe that interior space is probably one of the best or the best space in New York City, for the last 25 years.
You do?
The interior space, absolutely. Because of the fact that it completely, not unlike, in a funny way, I'm going to use another parallel, a dangerous parallel, which is the Guggenheim, which creates through the continuum of movement a series of remarkable spatial impressions. In this particular case, it's very different because it's asymmetrical. It's open towards, the glass wall and towards the campus. It is also a place of a multiplicity of activity. Now, the main thing about this student center is something that is more and more important in architecture today, is the mix of programs. In other words, it has an experimental theater, it has a cinema, it has dining spaces, it has a nightclub, it has computer rooms, it has bookstores, it has 6,000 mailboxes, it has a radio station. In other words, it becomes... The set of ramps becomes the hub, the place of meeting, the social space for that whole building, but also for the rest of the campus. We like, we have the steps, the low library steps, and we like the idea of seeing the ramps being the
Two
equipment.
things that come out of this that are interesting to me. One is that the idea of the ramps came from Europe?
From?
Europe or not? I mean, where did you get this idea of the ramps?
The idea of the ramps is as old as architecture.
Okay.
You have temples in Egypt which have ramps.
Did any part of that come from Europe?
No, there's a part of the technology that indeed comes from things which were invented, let's say, in the last 15 years, 20 years, which is to use glass, as we say, structurally. That is, glass without having mullions, and therefore being able to combine steel and glass in a direct way, not applying the glass, bringing it and hanging it onto the steel. And that's very new in this country. And even here in New York City, it was quite fascinating when we found out that we could have problem with the unions because the steel workers will not work when the glass workers arrive, you know. So we had to make an arrangement so that when our people would start to install the glass, and the steel had to be adjusted. It's very, you know, they're turnbuckles, and it's like someone said, it's like a Swiss watch. You have to adjust the steel in such a way that it fits exactly with the glass, and therefore you have steel workers and glass workers working at the same time. So that combination of technology was quite extraordinary, and that was new. It was certainly new in the city.
In 1968, students and others rioted in Paris, changed the face of the French government. It was the subject of intellectual discussion for years. Same thing here at Columbia. Student protest ignited that campus, seized buildings. Does any of this experience in Paris, what happened at Columbia, influence this building?
Directly, no. Indirectly, probably a fair amount. Why? Because any architect of my generation is an architect of the generation of '68. We were, in a sense, at school during that period. For some of us who were very interested in the critique that had been expressed about architecture, the institutions, the role of architecture in the city, that was absolutely fundamental. It was certainly very important for me. So we always felt that somehow architecture had to interact with some social issues. And therefore, any building which would have a public dimension, a public component, would be a building of interest. Right. So that's where suddenly it interacts with the idea of Lerner Hall. For me, it was a public building of sorts. And strangely enough, whereby we had indeed to stay within the McKim and White's, you know, sort of, I don't like to use the word context, but let's say norm. The system of ramps was that public space, and the intention was indeed to make it a major public space.
And to make a statement thereof, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, what's next for you? You're doing, you're commissioned by the School of Architecture at Florida International University in Miami, expected to be completed in 2001?
That's correct, that's correct. We are very heavily involved with that, yes.
A big commission to build a major train, bus, and subway station in Lausanne?
That's opening this year.
Scheduled for 2001.
That's opening this year. Also a large auditorium for 7,000 seats, which construction just started, literally this week, in Normandy.
Yeah. Is that in Rouen?
That's a big, in Rouen, yes,
yeah.
That's right. And that's a huge sort of pop music and major sort of events, which is an interesting building. Yeah.
Part of being both an academic and a practicing lawyer is that a practicing architect is that there are a lot of publications that come out, things like this. What is that?
That's GA. GA produces a number of monographs on architects with absolutely remarkable photographs. One of very, very important Japanese photographer, Futogawa, who has documented, let's say, the last 50 years of architecture.
This is Praxis?
Praxis, a new architectural magazine. Just started about 2 months ago. Two graduates from the School of Architecture at Columbia started that magazine, and that's their first issue.
Oh, wow.
And there's an interesting series of information on Lerner.
This was your first thing. Didn't you do this a long time ago?
Absolutely. That's my first year, 3-4 years in New York City, where exploring certain, let's say, conceptual issues about what architecture might be.
Yeah. And here is Lerner Hall at Columbia University, an architectural record, and this is Bernard Tschumi, Events and Cities. I'm sure there is more. Congratulations again on Lerner Hall. This is a good time for architecture.
Excellent time for architecture.
Thank you for coming. Bernard Tschumi from Columbia University. Back in a moment. Stay with us.